Iran has been witnessing mass protests following the death of Mahsa Amini, a 22-year-old who was beaten by what Iran calls the modesty police for wearing against the code that they believe women should follow in Iran. She was severely beaten by this police and she later died from her injuries in hospital, which sparked massive protests all across Iran. Now, it's important to note that Iran regularly sees protests every once so often. Usually they come around every 10 years, sometimes less. And in many cases, they were because Iran, or the Iranian elite to be specific, have gotten rid of specific people who are considered to be reformists. They closed down major newspapers at some points. And also it was due to political and social unrests and economic situation in other times. In most of these cases, the Iranian government was directly responsible for the uprisings that people had against its policies. However, not in all of them. In some other uprisings and protests in Iran, the main reason they were sparked was because of the devastating economic sanctions Western governments implement on Iran that have a devastating impact on the economic situation and the livelihood of the Iranian people. The main problem with the ruling class in Iran is the way they govern. You see, Iran is run by what's the closest description of how Iran is run is basically a theocratic democracy. Something similar to what Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi proposed in his writings in the 20th century in Pakistan. However, in the Iranian case, it wears a Shia robe, specifically a 12th Imami Shia robe. And what I mean by that is they took Abu al-A'la al-Mawdudi's philosophy to do with governing and they implemented their sect version on the way they govern Iran. The 12th Imami Shia sect within Iran is one of the most messianic sects in Shiism altogether. And it took a lot of debate to establish such a regime under the 12th Imami sect in Iran. Specifically because most followers of that sect at that time believed that the Mahdi, or the guided one, a figure that some Muslims believe in and that was originated in Shiism, he needs to come before they establish their own country or state. But that was overruled by specific mujtahideen in Iran, people who put in effort to interpret their basically beliefs in different ways. And they said we can basically establish a state before the coming of the Mahdi. Now, one of the main people who advocated for such a regime was Imam Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini was the first spiritual leader in Iran. He was based in France for a very long time, and he was advocating for the 12th Shia Imam ruling in Iran from France. The authorities let him freely advocate for it and call for it, and he even arrived to Iran in an Air France aeroplane to rule over the country. However, the clergy didn't start with Imam Khomeini. It was way before him. Ayatollah Khomeini's spiritual leader was called Ayatollah Kashani, and I would like a couple of moments to speak about Ayatollah Kashani because it's very relevant to what we're talking about today. In the beginning of the 1950s, Muhammad Mosaddegh, a secular democratic politician, was in power in Iran. He called for major changes in the country, and on top of them was the nationalization of the oil industry that was under British control since the beginning of the 20th century. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister at the time, did not like this, and he started preparing what he called Operation Boot, which was basically an intelligence service operation to overthrow the government of Mosaddegh, regain control of the oil resources, and have British interests saved in Iran. To do that, he had to get the support of the US. After persistently asking the Americans to help him, they finally did. The MI6 and the CIA jointly launched Operation Ajax, and soon after they overthrew the government of Mosaddegh and put in Shah Reza Pahlavi back in power, and he gained massive control, and the oil resources were split between the Shah and the Americans and British. Documents that were revealed later on showed that the MI6 and the CIA used torture methods, kidnappings, and they even paid for and orchestrated protests against Muhammad Mosaddegh's party. However, the main contribution to the success of the operation was because America and Britain had the clergy next to them. What they did in Operation Ajax was have agents within Mosaddegh's party that started to spark tensions and attack the religious institution and the clergy. That led to the clergy, led by Ayatollah Kashani, to side with the Americans and help overthrow the secular democratic government that was implementing many much needed reforms in Iran. They weren't called radicals or Islamists back then. They were simply champions of liberty. Something similar happened later on in the 1980s when the CIA helped the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, the same movements that were later portrayed as radicals and terrorists. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the US National Security Advisor at the time, went to Afghanistan to meet with his jihadi allies back then, the Mujahideen and other fundamentalist groups. When he saw them, he told them, quote, "The land over there is yours. You'll get back to it one day, because your fight will prevail and you'll have your homes and your mosques back again. Because your cause is right, God is on your side." Yes, you've heard that right. Zbigniew Brzezinski, the former US National Security Advisor, told the Mujahideen that God was on their side. The reason I mention this is to highlight that neither Western governments nor any other country have any problems with any government that calls itself Islamic, no matter how corrupt their interpretation is or how many wrongdoings they commit. None of the Western governments and the pro-Western government intellectuals mentioned anything when Saudi Arabia was chopping people's heads and limbs off as punishment when everything was going fine with Saudi Arabia. The Western upset from specific Arab and Muslim governments and its self-righteous, self-glorifying and moral criticism of such governments is selective. They're only upset with these governments and the religion they follow when they don't play ball Western style. You can be Bin Laden, Al-Qaeda, Taliban, anyone else for that matter, and get support as long as your interests are in line with the multinational interests of those countries. Once you start prioritizing your own interests over their interests, you turn to be from God's soldiers to subhuman devils. In the last 100 years, major Western countries played a proactive, persistent role as devastators to progression and democracy, not only in the Middle East and the Muslim world, but across the globe. Latin America, Africa, to be precise. Countries that don't get a lot of media coverage because of the illicit criminal activities that the governments of the US, France, and other Western countries do in these areas and parts of the world. In Venezuela, all it takes for you to be a prime minister or a president is just to claim that you're one. Peru, Mexico, you name it. Just 2 years ago, there was a massive coup in Bolivia when Bolivia stopped allowing massive corporations mining precious metals that are needed for batteries. Elon Musk back then tweeted, "We will coup whoever we want. Deal with it." It's not just evil capitalism in its pure form. It's something far deeper than that. It's a psychopathic sense of entitlement. Now that we've clarified that it's nothing to do with jihadis and it's nothing to do with human rights, it's safe to say that it's also nothing to do with Iranian women's right to take off their hijab. As a matter of fact, Muslim women in some Western countries are forced to take off their hijab and by law in specific countries. Ironically, even Israel officially produced a video to support the Iranian women and their right to wear whatever they want. And that video was taken near Bab al-Amud in Jerusalem. Not very far from that location, literally a few yards away from where that video was shot, there's an interrogation/torture room that Palestinian women get into or get taken into, get beaten up, bullied, harassed for no reason. So the same country that's supposedly supporting Iranian women is the same country that steps on the heads of Palestinian women who are willingly wearing a headscarf. There is no moral compass, no international values, and no freedom of choice when it comes to these things. It's all about selfish interests. That's not to say that what's happening in Iran is not based on real problems. There are many problems that need to be dealt with in Iran. Specifically, the ruling elite in Iran need to understand that religiously there is no compulsion in religion. La ikraha fi din. That's a verse in the Quran. You cannot force people to follow your interpretation of religion and force them to wear what you want them to wear. Iran must implement reforms because time after time it proved that the way it's running is a big failure. And the sooner they come with these reforms, the merrier. Both from the supposedly religious side and from the political side as well. These reforms must be made for the people of Iran, not to seek Western salvation. As this won't come unless Iran is willing to pay for it with its independence. Most Western governments, historically and to this day, dismiss anything to do with human rights, mass murder, apartheid when it comes to their interests, specifically global interests. They cannot take it seriously because historically and to this day, they're the biggest perpetrators of international war crimes. Now is the time for the Iranian government to act and implement urgent, much needed, significant reforms and make amends with its people.